folks, I think we've now reached the appointed hour. I'll have to just stand closer so that this is picked up on your mic too. So that mic that's on your lapel there. Okay, my name is Bertram McDonald, and I want to welcome you on behalf of the School of Information Management to this third in our public lecture series, the Information Management Public Lecture Series for the term. I just want to draw your attention to the next one, which will be in November, on November 26th, when Dr. Mona Humland and Cheryl Avery. Dr. Humland is a member of the faculty of the Department of History at Dow, and Cheryl Avery is at the University of Saskatchewan. And they're going to be talking about an archival topic. Dr. Humland has recently given a paper called Born Digital, Generational Differences in Attitudes Toward Privacy and Visual and Virtual Material Online. And then she's co-authored with Cheryl Avery a book called Better Off Forgetting, Essays on Archives, Public Policy, and Collecting Memory. So they'll be talking on a subject related to those themes. We don't have the actual title at the moment. So please mark Tuesday, the 26th of November at 3 o'clock in this room will be the next public lecture. Okay, so we've now, that's all the announcements that I have for the moment, so I'm going to turn to Ben Worth, who will introduce our speaker.
Students, faculty, and most welcome guests, thank you for joining us today for this exciting lecture by Elizabeth Dubois. Ms. Dubois is currently completing a PhD in Information, Communication, and Social Sciences at Oxford Internet Institute, University of Oxford. Her PhD research focuses on personal influence and political networks in a hybrid media environment. Ms. Dubois is a member of Balliol College and a current Clarendon Scholar. Before joining the Oxford Internet Institute in 2011 as a master's student, she completed a BA at the University of Ottawa. As a Killam Fellow through the Fulbright Foundation, in 2010 she studied at American University in Washington, D.C. Ms. Dubois works as a research assistant on Fifth Estate project and as a teaching assistant for research methods at the Oxford Internet Institute. Recently, she has been a visiting scholar with the Social Media Lab here at Dalhousie University. Previously, she served as a communications specialist and researcher in Parliament in Ottawa. Representing a major Canadian political party, she has led delegations to United Nations talks on climate change and has worked on multiple election campaigns. Working to bridge the gap between individuals and their government, Ms. Dubois has organized youth forums and events across Canada and internationally for over 6 years. She passionately works to encourage citizen engagement, working within politics, the nonprofit sector, and academia. Ms. Dubois has proven dedication to promoting citizen engagement in both partisan and nonpartisan political environments. A communication specialist, Ms. Dubois possesses a strong sense of leadership and innovation, having worked on multiple campaigns in a variety of roles. Be it climbing Mount Kilimanjaro or organizing the University of Ottawa Vote Mob, Ms. Dubois is someone who eagerly seeks out what is new, different, and challenging. Please join me in welcoming Elizabeth Dubois to speak about media, voters, and influence, which Twitter users matter.
Thank you. That's a little bit embarrassing. Somebody found my LinkedIn profile, apparently. Thank you so much for that, and thank you guys all for having me here. As was just mentioned, I've been visiting the Social Media Lab over the past 3 months, and it's been a wonderful experience. I'm from Dartmouth, and so getting to work on the Nova Scotia election studies that the Social Media Lab's doing has been really a wonderful opportunity. And so hopefully you're going to find some of these initial findings that we've got interesting. I'll just go here. This is a picture from a vote mob. So you might remember this from the last federal election. There were a bunch of students at universities across the country who got together and they started saying, hey, we need to bring attention to the youth vote. We need to try and get more people involved in their political system. They used Facebook and Twitter to try and get the message out, saying we're having this event come down to, at the University of Ottawa, it was Tabaret Lawn, and we're going to create a music video, essentially. And so they got lots of students out using social media, they filmed it, and then they put it on YouTube, and then they started sharing using a bunch of different social media applications, and then they started getting traditional media involved in this and started getting attention from the evening news. They were on radio programs and all kinds of different avenues to access information about these vote mobs. And I put this up here because this is really kind of the epitome of what's driving my research. It's this idea that we want to find ways to connect citizens to their political system, and we want to do that in the current media environment, which I describe as a hybrid media environment, okay? So it's not the mainstream media environment where we had kind of the political message senders and then the receivers, and there was a pretty narrow chain of kind of communication. Instead, we've got lots of different inputs and lots of different outputs. We've got political players, from journalists to politicians to activists to average citizens, all involved, and we've got people using lots of different technologies and tools to be involved. So what I'm going to talk to you about is 2 Twitter communities. I'm going to talk about NS Poly, which is the studies that I've been working on with the social media lab here about this current election. And I'm also going to talk to you about CDN Poly, which is the hashtag that people who are interested in federal politics tend to use on Twitter in Canada. Once we go over that, I'm going to explain a little bit about why Twitter and kind of preempt some of the questions that I often get asked when I'm talking about this research before going into a little social network analysis 101 class, just so that I give you guys the tools you need to interpret the fancy graphs that I put up that otherwise look a little bit like hairballs. And then finally, we're going to talk about which Twitter users matter, that research question that I've set out from the beginning. And then we'll end with kind of a Q&A session or discussion. If you've got any pressing questions as I go, feel free to just give me a shout, and I'll be happy to kind of explain in a bit more detail or go over whatever it is needed. So any questions at this point? No? All right, cool. So, first question, what's a hashtag? How many of you guys are actually using Twitter or have used Twitter? Okay, that's way more than normally happens. Way more. Good job, guys. Well, you can start tweeting me, Liz Dubois, and say, this presentation's awesome, right? Okay, so most of you probably know what a hashtag is, but I'm going to give the quick rundown anyway. A hashtag is, at its basic level, the # followed by a string of characters. And those characters represent a particular topic or community or event that people want to be connected to. So if I tweet and I put in CDN Poly to my tweet, I'm trying to connect with the CDN Poly community. I'm trying to talk about Canadian politics. And so people can start searching that hashtag and find all of the people who are talking about that topic, who are involved in that community. And that's a way that we can kind of organize the massive amounts of content that gets sent out over Twitter. And that hashtag was actually created by users. The creators of Twitter didn't think of this at first. It was users who said, hey, we need to organize ourselves a little bit better. So a lot of literature kind of within academia has looked at different hashtags and trying to figure out what they mean and how we can use them to start understanding groups of people and types of information as it kind of disperses. And there's a couple of different areas of research. We've got those who are looking at communities on Twitter and looking at hashtag communities. Anatoly Grust, who's the director of the Social Media Lab, is one scholar who's working in that area. We've also got a bunch of other people who are looking at it more in terms of information cascades and kind of news content that flows through Twitter. And so for these 2 reasons, we've got people looking at hashtags and hashtag communities and hashtag topics on Twitter, and that's kind of the base of literature that I'm setting myself in, just to kind of give you guys the broad overview. There's a whole bunch to go into, and so if you're interested in this topic, I can send you a reference list, but for now I think we'll just kind of get on with the lecture. Good? Okay. So, case 1, CDN Poly. This is an excerpt from an infographic that I created describing the basics of CDN Poly over a 1-month period this spring. From May 14th to June 14th, 2013, I accessed the Twitter API, which is basically Twitter's backdoor, and said, Twitter, give me all of the tweets you have that contain this hashtag. And that was 411,138 different tweets by 408,553 different accounts were mentioned in this. 45,000 or almost 46,000 different users made tweets in that time. So this is a really big data set. And it's way bigger than the CDN Poly data set normally is in any given month-long period, because this just happened to be the month where Mike Duffy broke, Rob Ford broke, there was an election in BC, there was a by-election in Newfoundland. It was a pretty exciting time for Canadian politics, particularly when you think that this was a few days before the House rose for the summer, which is normally kind of our least exciting time. But it makes a really interesting data set, and it means that we've got a lot of people who are involved in this community who might not have been otherwise. And so that helps us understand who's playing what parts in that group. The second case that this is that actual network. We're going to get into how to actually interpret that a little bit later on, but I wanted you to just get a sense of how big it is. All of those circles are different accounts that made at least one tweet using the CDN Poly hashtag in a month. The second case is NS Poly, and this is over a longer period of time. We're still collecting these tweets. We started mid-July, and you can see in that first graph that the number of tweets using NS Poly has increased over time. And you see that first big spike. That's the day the writ dropped, the day we found out when the election was going to be. That second spike is the date of the leaders' debate. And so we see that this hashtag is actually kind of growing in popularity. And so something that we're doing at the Social Media Lab is tracking the way this community is changing over time and getting a sense of how the different political players are influencing each other in that kind of chunks of different time periods. So the before the election was called, in that run-up, during the election, and then eventually we'll look at after the election. I've also put up this list of people who have been mentioned in that network so you get a sense of who's involved. Very kind of expectedly, we've got the NDP, the PC, the Liberals, and the leaders of those parties all there. We also have the Chronicle Herald, which would be expected. Journalists normally report on elections and politics. And then there's a couple of other accounts in there, like Mark Lavonshire, who is a staffer for the New Democratic Party. So this set is considerably smaller. We can look at the graph of that network, and you can already tell that there are far fewer nodes. And they're also all a lot closer in size to each other, which means that there aren't certain people who are very, very, very influential in the network and certain others who are just kind of completely separate from it. And this is partly because this is a mention network rather than a follower network. That first one I showed you, everybody was linked together based on who they chose to follow, so whose tweets they wanted to have brought into their own stream, whereas this one is based on who you actually make a tweet about. Okay? So, why Twitter? Well, this is just a starting point. Those two graphs that I showed you, there's tons of information to get out of it, and I'm going to go into how we kind of interpret those in a little bit and talk about who those influential players are and how the different pieces of the puzzle fit together. But we have to remember that it's just the beginning. It's only one piece of a much wider media environment, and we need to be thinking about this kind of in the context of all of the other pieces of that puzzle. It's particularly good as a starting point, though, because it's a place where we've got all kinds of news being shared. We're sending information out and receiving information. It's a place people go specifically to disseminate content, to broadcast. But it's also a place people specifically go to chat and to have political discussion. And so it's a really interesting social media platform because it differs from Facebook, where it's much more about sharing conversations with friends, or Reddit, where it's pretty much about sending out a post and maybe getting up votes or down votes. So it's a nice kind of combo of a couple of different things we see in the social media environment. And then finally, it's particularly good because it sets all of these different political players on level footing, more or less. They all are technically required to have the same basic profile. So we've got journalists and politicians and activists and lobbyists and unionists and average Joes, all with Twitter profiles, all with the ability to follow whoever they want. People are usually very public on these sites, and very few people end up restricting their tweets so that only their followers can see it and those people they approve. So it makes for a really good kind of environment to get to know. All right, so our question: which users actually matter? I'm going to answer this using a couple of different techniques, and I'm going to answer it in both the case of NS Poly and CDN Poly, so that you kind of get a sense of the different ways that we have of understanding this environment. The first approach is kind of to take that network graph that we saw and do a qualitative inquiry and look at who are in each of those clusters, what do those clusters mean, how do they change over time, and what can we draw from kind of measures of centrality and who's really connected to the cores of those networks. The second approach is much more quantitative, and it's going to set up a bunch of different metrics against each other and compare how they rank different users in terms of how influential they might be. So, step one, look at the graph. Okay, so how many people in this room think that they could probably pretty well describe what this graph actually tells us? Anyone? Okay, well, I know that there's at least 3 people in this room who can, but you don't have to raise your hand. It's all right. It's all right. This graph is really complicated and weird looking, and there's all kinds of colors, and we don't know what they mean. And so I'm going to go with a really, really tiny sample to explain the basics, and then we'll go back to this graph, okay? So this is a tiny sample. There's 2 tweets in this sample. There is the first account that it's called I'm Tweeting, and it's talking about MLA Bob, and it says, hey, read this article about MLA Bob. It's going to change this election. And then it has the hashtag, because that's how you get included into the sample. This hashtag's NS votes, but it could easily be NS Poly or CDN Poly. Then there's user number 2, Liz Dubois, who says, hey, Dalprof, did you see that cool article that I'm tweeting reposted about MLA Bob? And so now we've got a whole bunch of social connections between people. We've got I'm Tweeting, who's connecting to Bob by mentioning, and then there's Liz Dubois, who's connecting to Dalprof by retweeting I'm Tweeting and Bob, and so that forms more connections. So on the left side of this screen, we see what is the actual graph file, how we end up creating from those tweets an image like that network, that hairball, right? And so we see each of the different accounts that's going to be included. So each of the different circles, those nodes, that's the 4 at the top. And then the 4 things at the bottom are the different connections between those accounts. So we see that I'm Tweeting, who is user 9101, is connected to Bob, who is user 1121. And Liz Dubois, who's user 1234, is connected to all of the 3 other accounts in that network. And so what that ends up looking like is this. And this is a lot easier to understand than that big, crazy hairball that we saw before, right? This is, we've got Liz Dubois at the top, and she's connected to Bob and I'm Tweeting, who are connected to each other, and so that forms a more dense network. They're closer to each other, and so they physically show up closer to each other. Liz Dubois is the only one who talks to Dalprof in this scenario, and so he's way far away. Still connected by a line, but not as close to the others. Does that make sense? It's the basic logic, kind of. Yeah, the lines don't show up. I'm sorry. What you see here is the same way we had all of those edges in the bigger networks, where we saw all of those dots and those big groups of lines. There's one single one connecting each of these here. Can't do anything else about that. So if we go back to this, then we have a bit better understanding of how we actually interpret it, right? So we can see that that yellow group down at the bottom is pretty far away from that huge chunk at the top, right? And so that yellow group's kind of like Dalprop, who's not super connected. Still there's a link, but not as kind of integral to that dense network. And so in this graph, actually, that yellow dot is the PC Party and Jamie Bailey's account. They're all in that group. They talk to each other quite a bit. They talk every once in a while to the others, but they're quite secluded. And this is something that we find in networks kind of across Canadian politics. The PC Party is consistently separate from the others who are having conversations. We also see kind of in the very top corner where there's that blue-green mush, that's where the NDP are found. Almost right on top of NDP is Darrell Dexter. This account, or this graph, started or ended right on August 22nd, so this is before the election, and we see that that top group is really kind of mushed together, and we can't really tell much else about who those groups are at this point. But we can a little bit later on. This is the network as of yesterday. And so we still have that group down in the corner. This time they're light blue. That's the PC group. We can see that they've grown quite a bit, right? We can tell that people are galvanizing around that NSPC account and that Jamie Bailey account. They're growing. So we can tell that there's a group there that's influential, or at least present. Whether or not they're changing anybody's opinion, we can't actually tell just quite yet, but we can see that they're growing and they're attracting attention, and more people are talking to and about them. We also see up at the top, there's still on the left-hand side that kind of mass of different groups, but you can also tell a little bit that they're separating just a bit. On the far left side is where that NDP group is. The far left side is where the NDP group is. That mass of lots of different colors.
You know what far right? It's our right. It's our right.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. On the far right is the massive NDP support, and then in the middle we've got some Liberal support, and then on the other far side is a new cluster that we didn't see before. And so this is particularly interesting in an election period, because what new group comes out and all of a sudden starts talking about Nova Scotia politics? And if there is a new group that's all of a sudden very involved in this community, what does that say about our political system and who we need to be talking to? If this is a whole bunch of kind of average citizens who are all of a sudden engaged, well, that's great. That means political discourse is increasing. That's wonderful right before an election. In this case, that's actually a whole bunch of union workers and a bunch of people who are particularly big on healthcare reform. And as you might have seen, there's a bunch of healthcare signage that's gone up along with all of the regular election posters on people's lawns. And so it's likely that that's the same kind of communication strategist planning those two things out and getting that up there. The other thing to kind of note between this graph and the previous one, and remember the election happened and the debate happened in between those two, is that at the bottom of this graph and around, there are some isolates, some people who aren't really connected to that main group, but not a whole lot. Whereas in the next one, there's a whole bunch more. And so that's telling us that there are a bunch of people who are not really integral to those core political groups, but that do kind of participate in this conversation. So that's also interesting. And when we look at those specific accounts down there, none of them are those traditional political elite. Most of the traditional political elite, like the journalists and the politicians, are pretty integral and pretty connected, and these ones aren't. So the next thing that I want to talk about is how that kind of same logic applies to CDN Poly. The logic that I was just talking about is basically centrality. It's this idea of who's being followed the most, who's being talked about the most, right? And so for the CDN Poly, we can see these 9 images here, which is actually only 6 people, are the different accounts that were very central in the CDN Poly network. They are the most followed. Rick Mercer, the most mentioned, PM Harper, and the most retweeted, Min Rise, who is a well-known kind of Twitter kind of blogger, but really just talks about CDN Poly a lot. And so what we start to see is these are the people that are going to be the most visible. When you click on the CDN Poly stream, you see them a lot. The same way as when you click on the NS Poly stream, you see NS NDP, Premier Dexter, NS Liberal, NS PC. These are those equivalents here. And so this kind of could be the first answer to who matters on Twitter. You could just say it's the people who are most followed, most mentioned, most retweeted. But that doesn't really tell the full story, right? That tells us who's most popular. It doesn't tell us who is most influential in terms of who's actually going to be able to convince others to go vote for them or to change their opinion on Rob Ford or kind of any of the other issues that we see discussed in these networks. To do that, we've set up a bunch of different metrics. Okay, and so these metrics include some of those basic ones that we already talked about, the idea of centrality, for example, looking at maybe in-degree and eigenvector centrality. And it includes things like mentions and retweets, but it also includes some other things like how do we understand who is locally influential, who is going to be able to actually convince people using social pressure and social support to change their opinion. And so that's where we get into the delta clustering coefficient. And I'm going to go through each of these kind of in turn and hopefully explain it a little bit better. First thing we need, though, is to have a basis for comparison. We can't say that in-degree is better than delta clustering coefficient if we don't actually know what they're trying to measure and what they're trying to organize. And so to do this, we have to take all of our information and basically categorize it. I've got 56,000 users, and I need to understand whether they are public influentials or opinion leaders, or maybe they're just followers. Are they journalists? Are they politicians? I don't know. So doing a random sample of 1,200 of these 56,000 accounts, hand by hand, go through and say, this profile is the profile of a journalist. This profile is the profile of a politician. The other way to do it is an online survey, and so to go and say, hey, have you given advice to anybody on politics in the past 6 months? And then you say to the next person, have you given advice to anybody on a political issue in the past 6 months? And you ask them a series of questions, and they respond, and it takes a very long time, and it's very difficult to get people to actually give you full answers, and so it's not used very often, particularly online. But we tried it anyway and got some responses, which has been useful to kind of give us a sense of who's out there and who's engaging. Okay? So at this point, we've got that CDN Poly network. We know who is most central, and we know that we can identify kind of the core people who are very popular. But we also know we want to understand who matters on a bit of a deeper level. We've got our base for comparison using a sample from that wider group, and now we're going to compare the different measures that we've got. So to do that, we've got our public influential group, which is all of those political elite. We've got our opinion leader group, which is those people who use social pressure and social support to influence, and we've got our follower group who don't really influence. So it's kind of two main different types of influence, and then the non-influence group. And so the first one we come to is in-degree and eigenvector centrality. Now, in-degree is that measure where if I'm in the network and there are 4 other people in that network who follow me, I have an in-degree of 4. If there are 6, then I have an in-degree of 6. If it's a gigantic network, then there ends up being a lot of people who have an in-degree of 0 or 1 or 2, and very few people who have an in-degree of 56,000. So it becomes a measure of popularity. Eigenvector centrality takes it a step further and says, I'm going to give you a weighted score of how influential you are based on how many people who follow you are also followed by a lot of people. Okay? And so what these two measures show is we can really do a really good job at distinguishing between those public influentials, the journalists and politicians, and everybody else. This graph here shows us that those boxes, those are where the majority of people within that category fall in terms of their score on in degree. Okay? So if you have a very high in degree, you're higher up on this graph, and if you have a very low, you're much lower on the graph. And the boxes where the majority of people for that category fit. And so public influential is clearly distinct from the other two, but follower and opinion leader are kind of overlapping, and it's really hard to differentiate between the two based solely on in degree. Right? So what this means is if we want to know who matters in terms of centrality, then we can find quite easily a good point to cut off and say everybody above this point is probably a public influential. These are the ones who matter. Go look at their accounts. But if we want to differentiate beyond that, can't do it. So step 2. Retweets and mentions. This one kind of tells the opposite story. You can see that followers rarely get retweeted or mentioned, right? They're all near the bottom. There's a couple, those dots are individual cases. And when you think that there are thousands of users, those individual cases are kind of negligible, right? But the opinion leader and the public influential overlap again. And so what this is telling us is that, yeah, retweets and mentions could be really useful to understand who isn't very involved and who isn't very influential, but it doesn't help us distinguish between those political elite and the people who are involved in political discussion. Okay? And so then we've got the final measure that I'm going to talk about today, and this is the delta clustering coefficient. And this one's a bit more complex. Basically, we take that big network and we say, okay, score everyone based on how complete their local network is. Look at all of their followers and figure out how many of them are actually also following each other. If everybody who follows you also follows each other, then you have a clustering coefficient of 1. That's pretty rare, particularly in a big network. If you have a clustering coefficient of 0, you either aren't followed by anyone, or you only have kind of one connection or two, and they're not connected to anyone else. Okay? And so that will tell us who might be involved kind of in their local network, but it doesn't tell us about anything political or information sharing. To get that, we need to look at whose clustering coefficient actually goes up when you take out all of those information providers. So those main political elite, those ones that are sending out press releases and newspaper articles and kind of sending that content out originally, if we take them out, which we know we can do because the eigenvector centrality and in degree measures were able to identify who those people are. If we take them out, then the people who jump the most are actually going to be our opinion leaders, ideally. And so this graph actually shows us that, yeah, the clustering coefficient measure looks at things very differently from the others. What we've got here is basically a list of everybody in the entire network is ranked in order of how influential they are. And then we compare the different lists of rankings. So clustering coefficient ranked all 56,000 users in a very, very different way than any of the other metrics. And that's why there's a negative number, as is highlighted there, when you compare clustering coefficient to any of the other ones. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. Basically, what we come out with is a really rough guide to how we understand the structural placement of each different kind of user in the network. So we have a very rough idea of what a follower looks like normally. And this follower is often an isolate. Sometimes they're connected to a few people. They don't get retweeted very much. They pretty much hit a very low score on almost every single metric that we lay out. Then we have the public influential, which is pretty much the exact opposite. And so these are the accounts that are really well connected to all of the other people who are really well connected. This is the Huffington Post Alberta's ego network. So basically we had that really big graph right at the beginning that had tons and tons of different nodes. This is the chunk of that graph that Huffington Post Alberta is connected to, okay? And so we see that Huffington Post Alberta is connected to a whole bunch of other journalists and media outlets and politicians. You can see Sun Breaking News is in there, CBC Calgary near the top. A whole bunch of them are really, really tightly knit. And then along the edges, all of those really small nodes, those are ones that aren't connected to very many other people at all. And those ones are the people who are probably this opinion leader. They're people who connect with those media organizations, and they pay attention, and maybe they even chat, but they aren't connected to everyone. They're not part of the journalistic or kind of political elite community. And this one, as I already mentioned, have very high ratings for centrality, but pretty low ratings for clustering coefficient. The other point to note here is they make up a really small percentage of the actual community. It's only about 6% of all of the people who used the CDN Poly hashtag in that month-long period, which is pretty small when you think of the number of times they're retweeted and the actual volume of tweets that they make up. Okay? The final one is identifying that idea of the opinion leader. And so this person is the one who's connected to a bunch of politicians and journalists, the blue, but is also very deeply embedded in their own local network, the red. And those red are people who are likely to be either opinion leaders or followers themselves. They are the ones who are getting information from that main guy right in the middle, J.R. McQuarrie. And this group makes up about 32% of the population and has the highest delta clustering coefficient. Okay? And so what this actually is telling us is that we've got very distinct types of political players in these Twitter communities. And that's something that's interesting because up until this point, most research on kind of social media research and politics is actually just looking at those who is tweeting the most, and in Canadian politics, it's always Katie O'Malley. And then in Nova Scotia politics, maybe Katie O'Malley is still there, or maybe it's somebody like David Akin who's suddenly taken a big interest in Nova Scotia when the election was called. But you don't really get a sense of who else is participating and how they might be impacting each other. And so that's what this kind of investigation has allowed us to start to do. With this, obviously, comes a range of limitations. We already talked about how this is only one piece of a larger media environment. I've been able to tell you who's the most influential on Twitter based on the number of different ways of understanding what influence is, but I haven't told you who is the most influential kind of in terms of Canadian politics more broadly, or even online, because there are so many different applications that make up our media environment. We also need to note a couple of important things that are missing from the two hashtag networks that I looked at. In Nova Scotia, the biggest thing that's missing is actually the media. We talked about how those politicians and their parties are very central, but nowhere did we see CBC News, CTV News, the Herald, Global. None of them really came up, or when they did, they were very small and kind of non-influential in the network in terms of, in the terms that kind of I've laid out, right? And that doesn't mean that they're not influential in Nova Scotia politics by far. And it doesn't even mean that they're not on Twitter. You can see on the CBC News page right here, they've got a Twitter stream right on their main Nova Scotia Votes profile. It's obviously something that they're putting time and energy into, but they're not turning up in our sample. And so that presents quite a big problem because clearly they're not using hashtags to find those tweets or to participate in that conversation, at least not the NS Poly one, right? If they were, they'd be central. Well, there's a couple of explanations. Maybe they're using one of the other hashtags, like NS Votes, NS Election, CBC Politics. Maybe they're using Twitter lists, so rather than trying to find specific, or trying to find just in the mass of tweets that happens, which can get very noisy, they look for very specific people to get their information from. Or maybe they're following only other accounts. Maybe journalists only follow each other and then they don't care about what the general public's talking about. which is possible and goes against a lot of the early research in this area that's really kind of been hoping for the revival of democracy and an open public sphere. The other big problem with this research is that when I say who matters, I'm not talking about a person. Twitter accounts aren't people. Some people run Twitter accounts. Lots of people have Twitter accounts, but so do lots of organizations, and lots of people also like to write programs to make Twitter accounts happen. Halifax NS Retweet is a really good example. This is a bot that retweets every single post that's made on Twitter that has the word Halifax in it. There's also a suggestion that there could be, for more nefarious reasons, bots that come out and try and make it appear as if there's a whole lot more conversation about a specific issue or person going on than there actually is. And so it's important to remember that when we're talking about who matters, it could be organizations, it could be parties, it could be people, it could be voters, but it could also be accounts that have been created by somebody we don't know. And that anonymity online is something that is going to continue to be an issue every time we have a new application, whether it's Twitter or not. It's been an issue and an ethical concern since the internet was created and since we've had different applications to connect with each other. So I want to kind of leave it there at this point. I've got some questions that I think are pretty interesting, but I also want to kind of open it up to hear from you to see what you guys might think, or if I need to explain anything in more detail.
Okay, questions?
This is probably something that I don't know how you'd go about approaching this, because I guess influence for me has a rather different meaning, because influence doesn't make a difference bottom line to the results of an election, for example. So how do you get past that? Because this is looking very quantitatively at actual followers, and this it's spot on. But the other issue is the more qualitative aspect is rather challenging as well. So do you actually interpret the content? With all this data, it's probably unlikely that you can do that.
Yeah, it does.
Sorry, we're going to repeat the question so it's heard on the recording. But it's really a question of how do you define influence?
Exactly.
Right. All right, so when we're trying to understand how to define influence, obviously it's a big problem. It's not a problem that social scientists have been able to answer in any clear form. The definition that I tend to go with comes from Katz and Lazarsfeld's work on the two-step flow hypothesis. And so for people who don't know media studies theory, Katz and Lazarsfeld in the 60s proposed this idea that the mainstream media affect the general public in an indirect manner. There are those opinion leaders who come in and they take the mass media message and they interpret it and use social pressure and social support to change the opinions, attitudes, and behaviors of their everyday associates. And so it's that change of opinions, attitudes, or behaviors that is the influence process. And so that obviously is still very broad and still very hard to define. And when it comes to this data set and trying to interpret it in that way, there are a couple of basic things that we can look at. Making a retweet or mentioning is often taken as an indicator of influence because it shows that the information was taken on board and then a decision was made to send it back out. There is also a certain level of we need to get into this content to understand what people are saying and how people are saying, whether or not they made a retweet and right before the retweet they said this was a stupid article, or whether they said this is awesome, everybody needs to read it before they die. Right? Because those are two very different kinds of retweets. And so I do go through and do some basic content analysis on random samples of tweets in most of my projects. I like to work kind of in a very mixed methods way, and so I think it's particularly important. But when you've got over 400,000 tweets, you can't look at all of them. Netlytic, which is a tool that was developed at the Social Media Lab, has some basic kind of topic recognition software that's built in, and there are computer scientists working on how to understand the content of massive amounts of data all the time, but it's a huge problem that takes a lot of kind of careful thinking.
Other questions?
Yeah?
What was the most surprising thing that you found with these data sets?
Yeah.
Personally.
Me personally.
So the question is, what was the most surprising?
The most surprising with NS Poly was definitely the lack of journalists. It's in CDN Poly, journalists are driving the conversation. In NS Poly, they're not there at all, or very rarely. And that seems so strange for a place that we know is active, and we know that engaged citizens, people who care about politics, go there, right? The people who don't care about politics don't go there, right? And so you would think that wanting to get to more readers, you'd go to the places where you know your readers are likely to be. And so something that I'm really interested in doing is maybe going and talking to the journalists and figuring out why they're not doing that, why they're not engaging with the hashtag or any of the other main election hashtags for that matter. Yeah. Yeah?
So thank you, Elizabeth, for your presentation. You mentioned one of the last slides about limitations and hashtags, the key issues, because they're user-driven, and sometimes users adopt new hashtags. So from research perspective, have you given any thoughts how we as researchers in this space can find a better tools or methods to collect more complete samples? When you start collecting data with one hashtag, and then users would come up with a different hashtag, and they move away from that. How do you detect and make sure you capture those type of messages? Have you given any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and it's definitely a huge problem. There's the idea that hashtags change over time, as well as the idea that people might migrate away from hashtags altogether and start using lists or following specific people that they know are going to filter the information that they might need. And so trying to understand as researchers what to do is a big concern. And I don't, off the bat, have the right answer. But there are a couple of techniques available. One is to monitor the tweets as they're coming in. Don't just set up a system to say, collect all of these tweets and I'm going to look at them after my data collection's over. To be monitoring as you go is really important, because if you're doing that, you're able to see when this new topic spikes. What's this new topic? Election 13. Oh, maybe this is a new hashtag, and then you can go and investigate and get a sense of whether or not it's actually relevant. And this is something that we did on the NS Poly project. We saw that right after the election, NS votes and NS election 13 started to crop up as used hashtags. We started collecting NS votes right away because it was the one that was gaining the most steam, whereas NS election 13 was kind of dwindling even after a couple of days, and so we kind of left it to the side.
Thank you.
Yeah?
There was a fair amount of media coverage about your analysis of NS Poly this year. You became almost part of the community that you were observing. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on how that impacted the results, and any thoughts you have on how this impacted what you're doing.
Yeah, so the question was kind of, a lot of media coverage has come out over the course of our analysis, and we've kind of moved from being an observer to being a participant, and what does that mean? And it means a couple of different things. It means, one, we're doing a good job because this is relevant right now and people actually care about it. And as researchers, as you guys probably all know, it's really hard to get the general public to be really invested in your work, particularly when you're looking at something like politics, which has a very short shelf life, right? People don't care about the Nova Scotia election for very long after it ends. So that's good. On the other hand, yeah, we've created a story that got tweeted about, and people are talking about us in our own sample, right? Right? They're saying, like, these guys don't know anything about Nova Scotia politics. They have no idea what Twitter is. This is terrible. Some of them were also nice. It's true. Some of them were good. No, but the idea is we need to build into our system, as we're doing our analysis, an understanding of we're part of this environment. It's really easy to be a completely not there observer online, to be a lurker. And it's really easy to be very, very engaged, but it's hard to walk on that middle ground. And that's something that people who study the internet and people who study any community have been dealing with for a very long time. For me, it means that I need to be really cognizant of what's happening. I like to follow tweets as they come out, and I do these kind of mini random samples as I go to really make sure that I'm understanding what's happening, and so that I can really be able to articulate clearly what my impact has been.
Yes, I wanted to tie back to some of the things you mentioned at the beginning, especially regarding democracy. So, by looking at this, are you getting do you have a way to measure? Is there any sense that the debate is becoming bigger about politics and those sorts of things? And is Twitter an appropriate tool for actually doing what we wanted to do, opening the democratic debate?
Yeah, so okay, the question is looking at whether or not Twitter is an appropriate tool for increasing democratic debate, what we can kind of see, whether we can measure aspects of how democratic it is. And a lot of people have been trying to answer this and trying to get at this. There's a lot of work being done on echo chambers, for example, the idea that maybe people are talking on Twitter, but they're only talking to people who also already agree with them. And that is, on the one hand, well, there's some political chat, perfect. On the other hand, are you really getting any meaningful debate, which is the real requirement of democracy, if you follow kind of Dowell's ideas of what democracy should be. And even at that, we're seeing a decline in that kind of conversation. At least in the NS Poly example, we didn't see, or haven't been seeing at least, a lot of conversation about specific issues. The topic that is most often interesting to most of the people in this group is, this is the next leader, this is the next premier, this is the party that needs to win, and it's not talking about issues. And so again, it's talking about politics, and we definitely saw the network grow over the course of the campaign, so that's good. But the content, we haven't really gotten there yet. I personally think that kind of the way forward in that research is to start to pair these network analysis tools that we have with in-depth interviews with focus groups and much more kind of rich qualitative analysis to get a better sense of it.
Can we go to your last question that you got there about the role of bots? Do you have thoughts about the role of bots?
Yeah, so this is a difficult one, because when we're thinking about political discussion and democracy, it's citizens engaging, and it's citizens participating and making their voice heard. And then when you take the pulse of public opinion, you're supposed to be getting the pulse of society, right? But when you are taking the pulse of Twitter, that's not exactly what you're getting necessarily. And if there's lots of bots, it's definitely not what you're getting, because somebody who's more technologically savvy could be sending out way more information than somebody who isn't technologically savvy. And then you get into the question of, well, maybe that's just them being more clever, and it's a media environment, and this is a campaign, and so if people are doing them, that's just a clever use of technology and it's justified. And so there's this weird kind of ethical issue and this balance that nobody really knows how to figure out just yet. I personally think that the way around this is to make sure people know that these kinds of accounts exist. Make sure people understand and can identify the different types of people who are participating in these different kinds of conversation and the different types of programs that might have been written to make a certain topic spike on a particular day, or to give somebody a whole bunch of followers overnight.
But bots also exist in their context too, so that people don't even know that they're talking to a bot.
That's
And they get upset when the bot says, do you know that you're talking to a bot? And the person will respond, no, you're a person.
That's true, and sometimes it's really hard to understand what's a bot and what isn't, and a lot of accounts are actually kind of semi-bot, where there'll be some tweets that are posted automatically and other ones that are an actual person. Anybody on Twitter can set their account to send a post out at a certain time. You don't have to be at your keyboard pressing send or pulling out your phone pressing send at that time. You could send it out, and then that's kind of like you're being semi-automated, right? And then there's also other accounts that we don't think of as bots that are. CBC News, their account is a bot. It posts stories every time a new story gets put onto their website. But we don't think about it like that. So the big problem that I see is trying to understand this kind of grouping of different political players, because they don't fit into our normal categories necessarily.
Mike, you have a question then here.
Building on that same question, did you notice activity in the NS Poly hashtag after the media coverage? Because I know originally the story was that there was a lot of NDP tweeting. So for example, did you see people from the PC party saying, oh yeah, we'll see about that, and trying to play with your numbers that way, or not at all?
You know, that's really flattering to think that the campaign strategists read my blog. That'd be great. I think the fact that an election was called is probably the better explanation for why we saw the other parties start to tweet a whole lot more. But you know, if I contributed, then great. We definitely, and the one that actually jumped the most is the PC party, which is unexpected because traditionally it's not the conservatives who have been most active on social media or on Twitter. And it's that group that we saw kind of have the largest increase. Of course, it's proportionate to what they were before. It's really easy to have a big increase when you were very small at the beginning, but it's still noteworthy, and it still says that somebody somewhere said, or many somebodies somewhere said, hey, we need to be involved here, let's start having this conversation.
Hey, great presentation, that sort of made me nostalgic for DPhil summer presentations back in Oxford. We have to maybe sort of follow on this one and press you a little bit more on it, because I think it's a really interesting question, right? So with my own research, what I found, which looks at intellectual property enforcement online and how the impact that has on users, what I found that sort of, for example, the Digital Money and Copyright Act in the United States, which began very organically, it was like real people sending notices to real users and having an impact. Over time, it seems more and more to be robots sending notices to other robots, right? So it's just robots sort of posting things online, receiving notices, and like moving them to other directions, and then robots sending out more notices. And also, sort of relatedly, I saw a really interesting paper, and this is, I think, building off a point that was just made I attended Usenix this year, and there was a really interesting paper about how in certain authoritarian regimes, around election time, you have these sort of Twitter botnets that appear and attempt using hashtags to drown out legitimate political debate, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of in different countries, Iran, China, a few other, I don't think it was Iran because they're blocked, but China and a few other countries where this is sort of used through possibly, the research suggested it, though it was not quite a smoking gun. So I'm wondering if things are moving in that direction. So two questions. One is, do you ultimately see maybe in the long run, hashtags that are helping or hurting the kind of promoting the kind of legitimate debate that you're talking about?
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, for some of the solutions that you're proposing here, do you view them ultimately as having technological solutions to these sorts of problems, or do you see the role for laws here? like a law where it's banning a certain kind of botnet during election time. So the same way we have Election Canada restrictions on posting election notes. Could you envision maybe government having something like there's no kind of automated tweets during the election era, something like that? So I know these are sort of big questions, but.
Sort of big questions, just sort of. All right, so the questions are, repeating for the mic, basically, are we going to see kind of bot-to-bot conversation on hashtag networks, basically drowning out any sort of legitimate democratic discussion that might be going on? Presumably, actually, that would also just push the leftovers away, and people who had been using the hashtag to that point might just say, forget it, I'm going somewhere else. And then the next question is, how do we solve some of these problems? Is this the job of law? Is it the job of code? Is it the job of social norms, I might add on? And so let's go to the bots talking to bots question first. I think that definitely could happen, and we see hashtags where bots start to take over. We saw in the NS Poly hashtag on the very first day of the election, all of a sudden spam bots were just swarming. And what happens is you require users to go and start flagging account after account after account. And it worked. Within a couple of days, NS Poly was clean of the majority of spam bots. So these aren't the bots like CBC News that's posting legitimate content that contributes to the conversation. Not that they use the hashtag, but the general idea. These are ones that are talking about like meeting up with Alex and other kinds of things that are not about Nova Scotia politics or any kind of political issue. And so part of it is the community. As long as the community is interested in keeping the hashtags clean, I think that Twitter has put the architecture in place to help solve that problem. Twitter is definitely playing a role and will continue, I think, to play a role in terms of creating a code architecture that prevents a lot of the negative things that we see potentially happening when certain kinds of bots enter the playing field. I do think that in some instances there may be kind of a role to be played by law. I think that there are instances where kind of hate speech come out online, and this is not kind of unique to Twitter, this is everywhere, that law has to play a role. The difficulty, of course, is Twitter is not based in a single country and accessible to one single country's users. Twitter is something that you can get anywhere, and you can route your tweets through servers that are not in whatever country you're in, and there's all kinds of problems that come up. And you, obviously, as a lawyer, would know a lot more about the technicalities of all of that than I do. But I do think that law has to play a role alongside code. I think, though, that the biggest part of this, and the part that's going to be able to push forward more laws that are, or push forward the demand for legal change, is the social norms aspect. And I think that's where we have to have either communities of people demanding we treat each other better, or we find other ways to do the thing that we want to do. So democratic discussion might not happen on Twitter and hashtags. Maybe people are going to get fed up and they're not going to get the answers they want from Twitter as the code architects, or from lawmakers as people who are required to go through a very long process. Maybe they're going to go and find another way. The same way they created the hashtag in the first place, right? It's something that is an ecosystem.
Okay, I think we will now ask a student who's going to thank her and our speaker. Thank you.
On behalf of the school, the information manager, I'd just like to present you with this token of appreciation
thank you.
for your lecture today.
Thank you.
Okay, that concludes our lecture. I'm sure Elizabeth will be here for more questions. For those students who are here for the Information Society class, there is the sign-up sheet which you can sign on your way out. And just keep in mind that our next lecture is near the end of November, and you'll see more